Hi. Yeah, thank you, Jen, for the intro. As she said, my name is Antoine Butler, and I'm a front-end developer for an advertising agency outside of DC called HZDG. We build, websites and apps for organizations like National Football League, Volkswagen, and so on. And I'm really excited to be here because I'm on a team of 14 developers who are primarily full stack. They do really crazy JavaScript stuff, Node, and Python development. And I'm one of the few dedicated front-end developers, which makes something like CSSConf really awesome. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone for having me and not doing a B track right now instead. So thank you. So on to why I'm actually here, my talk, Embrace the Vertical, the future of hype media queries. When I went around to my team, I kind of asked them, if you were here, what do you want to know about vertical media queries? And apologies, my thing's slipping here. And pretty much the consensus was, what are vertical media queries? And I thought, you know what? That's a really good question. So maybe I'll backtrack and make sure we're all on the same page as far as what a media query is. So I apologize if this is a very entry-level introduction to the subject matter. So again, what is a vertical media query? I'm going to paraphrase the spec because it's entirely too wordy, which reads, a media query allows you to tailor your layout based on any number of conditions against a media type. And those available conditions are, of course, aspect ratio, orientation, resolution, color, and size. And while I'm here is to talk to you guys about size, because it's not just the width that counts. Yeah, I had to. That gives me a moment to breathe. So pardon me if I sound ridiculously nervous, or if I don't, then yay me, because this is also my first talk ever. So yay. And luckily, I think we're kind of running a little over, so I might be able to make this short and get everyone to lunch on time. But I wanted to quote Chris Coyier from an article, I think 2 years ago, where he said, measuring width is a nice practical example of media queries, but it's not the only thing available. But despite that, if you go to any CSS gallery, you're littered with websites that are responsive based entirely on its width. I mean, even media queries, mediaquery.es have sites that are responsive almost entirely based on their width. So to kind of reiterate what a media query is this. This is what we all typically do and what we see on the CSS galleries. Are we running a media query and we're testing against a width size, a max width or a min width? A vertical media query does the perpendicular. I'm just checking against the height. Hence the name, embrace the vertical. So what? Why does it matter? That's a good question, because I mean, if you look, we all in this room have done some amazing things using the width as our primary condition. But I don't think that's good enough. I think there's opportunities for us to do some really cool things with our layout based on height. So one of the reasons that I don't think the width is good enough and why height is important is, one, because content size is variable, not intrinsic. And by content, I mean words, not images. Because of course, if we tell our image to be 100% width and we make our width more narrow, the image gets smaller. Our content, our words, don't scale. All right? We make our widths narrow and the content gets taller. Another reason is that we increase the scrolling, which isn't a bad thing because the fold doesn't exist. But it is an opportunity for us to improve upon the user's scrolling experience. Another reason is device fragmentation. And by device, I mean any electronic or mechanical device that we use to consume web content. So not just handheld tablets, but also the laptops and eventual TVs that we will peruse the internet with. And a shameless plug for my wife, who is a rabid fan of Wizard of Oz. netbooks, Apples, and Androids on mine. These are the devices that we're talking about, not just the handheld stuff that's in our pockets right now. Also the laptops that are on our desk, and yeah. So question, who here remembers this? I think it actually originally was posted around 2010, but they did another article in 2013 to discuss device fragmentation. When this came out, I mean, there was blog posts left and right about how responsive web design was destined to fail because there was just too many variables. To me, it felt like responsive fear-mongering. It wasn't like we could just go out and set all the breakpoints. So I always hated that graph because it was overwhelming. You couldn't really grasp what needed to happen. What I liked better was this graphic from the same article, which kind of does a better job of explaining what we do, because it shows the endless amount of widths that we all have to deal with doing responsive web design. But even this only tells half the story, which is why this graphic is actually my favorite, because it shows that the height is just as variable as the width. After all, these devices move in both directions, and it doesn't even account for the fact that we can change the orientation of our devices, which then makes our width our height and our height our width. One of my last reasons why this is important is because squishy is not good enough, unless we're talking dodgeball, because I've watched my kids play, and it doesn't matter how soft the ball is. So to quote myself and take a drink of water, delicious. Squishy is a legacy solution, but it is also the foundation of responsive web design. Basically, a show of hands, who here has ever done this? Not in an email. So this is old school. I mean, I'm glad there was a lot of hands, because that means I'm not the only old one here, even though I have less hair than most people. This is what we all used to do to make fluid websites. This was what we did before responsive web design was a thing. This is pre-Y2K, pre-squishy. This is when tables were in. And this same premise of just filling your browser's width is all that responsive web design kind of relies on as its core tool. And that's why we're here, to this side with this guy with his accordion, which is supposed to be a metaphor for how websites, like an accordion, are squishy horizontally, even though you could hold your accordion this way and it would still work. But anyway, I wanted to keep him in there because he looks awesome and he's happy. But anyway, my point is that you can only be squishy in one direction, or reliably in one direction, and that's along the width. So what do we do with that being our limitation? We actually can't be responsive. Instead, we have to adapt or die trying. I'm going to paraphrase, actually not paraphrase, I'm going to repurpose a quote from Karen McGrain for A List of Parts. Responsive web design won't fix your content problem, where she said, smart organizations will see this as a benefit, not a drawback, and will use this chance to make a better website, not just a squishy one. She wasn't talking about vertical media queries or going back to adaptive design, but the sentiment is true here. So again, I want to go back and then redefine yet again what exactly a vertical media query is. A vertical media query is not a responsive tool. It is actually an adaptive solution to our content design and user experience problems. So now onto the meat and potatoes of my talk, why everyone is here, hopefully, is to see some potentially cool code. And this will be the fun part, because this is the part I haven't practiced so much. So here we go. So first up, I wanted to kind of investigate an existing site, an existing opportunity for vertical media queries. And I wanted to make sure I picked a website where the developers who are involved in it won't hate me. So I picked Wikipedia. So the use case is long-form reading. The solutions that Wikipedia actually do themselves can be used on blogs, articles, research papers. It's not unique to Wikipedia. Anything that has a lot of content this approach that they do to their layouts, we all can adapt in some way for our own purposes. So I needed an article to use as my example, and since we have a party tonight, I figured I'm going to use my drink of choice, which was bourbon. And yeah, find me tonight if I make it through this talk. So I searched for bourbon whiskey, and the Wikipedia article looks something like that when you scroll it on your desktop. Yep. Okay, now we're finished. That was fast. We didn't read anything. So imagine trying to experience that on your mobile device. Luckily, we don't have to, because Wikipedia's own mobile page says users of supported mobile devices are automatically redirected to the official mobile version of wikipedia.com, which looks like a much more pleasing and consumable that. But when I inspected the iOS simulator, I realized two things. One, the markup was ridiculously simple, and simple enough that it could actually serve the desktop. But instead, they give us two entirely different code bases, two entirely different URLs, and they redirect. So I wanted to compare the mobile versus desktop solution or UI. And essentially all they did was they simplified the navigation, they used an accordion layout, they centered their images, and they changed their font to a more readable serif. All those things we can do without a separate URL and a separate code base. So what I want to do is build a prototype, very bare bones, kind of showcasing a use case for vertical media queries. But what I'm going to do is not worry about the simplified navigation, because, well, that's just too much spec work for a day. So here we go. So what we have here is a very dumbed down version of the Wikipedia mobile HTML, which is basically a div with an ID content. We've got an H1 for our article title. They've put all their images inside of divs with class thumb. Got an introductory text, and H2s with ARIA roles that match the ID of the sibling div, and that's where their content is. I didn't want to deal with that, so I converted it to something a little more readable, yay for semantics, and we went with an article, keeping the H1, we're using figures instead of divs. We got the introductory text. We have an ID on our H2, and we're using sections for the content separation instead of divs. And if anyone wants to actually follow along from this point to see the more fleshed out, stylized prototype, just bit.ly/wikiproto. Right, so I'll give you all 5 seconds to not do that. And now we're going to just go into some base CSS to kind of get us there. So the first thing I did was, and again, this is kind of roughly based on the actual existing wikipedia.com. I just set a font weight, font size, line height, sans serif font. We're going to put a border under our H2s, and we're going to float all our figures to the right and center the text. There's more in the actual code example in that URL that you can mess around with. But basically, what we end up getting is a very Wikipedia-like layout. This is essentially Wikipedia, I mean, with links and more images and a really robust navigation. So this works. Now I'm going to go and throw in some media queries. So the first thing we do is I'm going to go with an actual traditional width-based media query first that will essentially just tell our figure to be full width, and we already have our content centered. So if you're on a device that's 650 pixels small or a browser that is 650 pixels wide, it will center your figure elements. And then we're going to use a vertical media query. And all we're really doing is font family, serif, and hiding all the sections. And mind you, this display none is exactly what Wikipedia is doing. There's no animations, there's no nothing. They're just toggling display none, display block on their div. And it turns this into this. And again, if you check out the URL, you'll see it's that. You don't need to do anything else. There's no redirect. There's no nothing. So if you throw in some image loading love, slick nav, and maybe actual images, you would potentially render the mobile version of Wikipedia.com unnecessary. So the benefits of an adaptive Wikipedia.com or an adaptive anything really comes down to you don't have to worry about device detection, which has its own woes. You work with a single code base, and since all of us in here write code, the less code you write, the better, right? And you get improved SEO and shareability. And it's great. So Wikipedia.com, that's my first example. My next example is VW.com. So much for picking sites that people won't be mad at me. But this is actually an internal project as well. So I think it warrants a little backstory. So VW.com was recently redesigned, and this is their nav. We did not design it, we didn't build it or anything like that. And this fixed nav on the left, they absolutely loved. They met all the requirements of the clients, the UX, everything worked. You click more, and you got the navigation to slide out off the screen. This is not a mobile or tablet approach. This is just desktop. And they liked it so much that when they came to us for the properties that we are responsible for, they wanted to reuse that exact same nav, except it had entirely different requirements. And those requirements just don't work with what was designed and approved. So those new requirements were primary navigation must support up to 6 items. And if we actually go back, that was too fast. Ninja. There we go. So this is actually full screen on my 15-inch MacBook Pro. I've got enough room for 2 more items there. But if I'm not full screen, I don't have room for 2 items. And if I have my dock exposed, I might have room for 1 more item. And if I'm on a 13-inch MacBook Pro, I don't have any more room for anything. So we're talking a desktop experience that needs to be adaptive. The second requirement was that the secondary navigation, which is what you will see when you click on more, I needed to be able to support an unlimited number of items, which means you can scroll within it. It means the navigation can have 10 items and it can have 100. That's a whole other design problem. But the third reason, and this is actually something that I added to the requirements because I used to do front-end development for the government, so I like to try to make sure things are as accessible as possible. I wanted everything to be keyboard accessible. Didn't want to have to rely on JavaScript to build out my UI or to access content. So this is what the navigation on the current site looks like when it's fully exposed. We've got the 4 primary navigation, which you'll see on the right, and we've got the list of secondary navigation, which is on the left. And again, if you want to follow along from this point with my own prototype, please go to bit.ly/stickynav. I'm really surprised that wasn't taken already. People are lazy. So again, bare bones HTML. This is what I started off with. Nav element, unordered list. I chose to keep my LI for the logo inside the list instead of using a separate header. And then all the additional navigation items are marked up like so. We've got an LI, a link, an image for the icon, and the link text within a span. Now, we can handle that image tons of different ways, but for my prototype, that's the way I went with it. So that's the way it is. And like I said, there can be 100 of those if you want. And now for my disclaimer, my following slides of code are using less, not SAS, because I bet on the dark horse. So is anyone in here with me? Oh, and some of you are lying. You're lying. All right, so first thing I did was to kind of easily themify this. Created a theme variable just so I can save colors and if I needed to meddle with them later for hover states and things like that. The next thing I did was I set a font size, and you'll see that these EM values go ridiculously long at points, but I go ahead and put the pixel value over there as a comment so you know what we're working with. But essentially it comes down to our nav-based font size is 11 pixels. Each individual nav item is 95 pixels by 95. That is a design requirement, which also makes the button potentially fragile if the text gets too long. And then the exception to our primary nav size is that the logo height has to have its own, so I'll put that in a variable. Then we set the drawer width, which is the nav that sits outside of your view, to 21.363636, or 235 pixels. And the two magic numbers at the bottom, which are my favorite because this actually allows this prototype to be really flexible since this nav has to exist on multiple sites with multiple requirements. One site might say we only want 4 nav items. One site might say we want to have 10. So at any point, you can just change that highlight number or even the minimum number and enforce a new set of rules on that nav. So up next, we have the nav-based styles. And this is where I said I gave up writing notes. So I'm just going to try to run through each line of CSS quickly. But we're going to just transform the nav. We're going to move it to the left so that the drawer nav, the secondary nav, is out of view. We're going to position it fixed to the top. I'm going to set the width and some typography choices here so that it kind of matched what was on vw.com. Then we style the actual individual navs, the images and the spans within them. So I just go ahead and put the paddings on there. I've got some text treatments, another transition, and we're going to position our image and spans to be in line. So this is that secondary nav where the text is not a perfect square. It's actually kind of a stacked nav, single line. And the CSS for the UL itself, we set our width. We want it to scroll. That way it can grow forever. You can just scroll within that side pane. And I chose to use CSS content to actually style the separator between the secondary nav and the primary. And all that pretty much just gives us this. This is our default navigation that appears off screen. So that is our native state. With no other work done, that is all we end up with. And now for a weird little adjustment to our variables for minimum number and highlight number. In this instance, since I kept the logo in the nav, when we're counting how many nav elements we want to have, I have to add one to account for the logo. That's just deeper into the CSS. No one should be meddling with that. It's kind of like part of the framework in a way. So next we had to create it all fits on there? Good, yay. I had to create a mix-in that basically would stylize this native nav to look like a primary square nav item. And I did so by using display table, which is our new old friend. We position it absolute, and we're going to position it off to the right. Notice I'm not setting its top position because we're going to automate that later. And then I tell the individual links to display table cell, vertical align them in the middle, and then just set the padding and size on them. And now I'm telling my image to be display block. So everything looks like that when it gets the highlight mix-in applied to it. So now we actually have to worry about how to position everything. Since we're taking a whole bunch of stack navigation items on the left and positioning absolute on the right. And we want to do that in a way that's not fragile. So I wrote two mix-ins that will basically do all the work for me. One is called position nav, yay for readability, that essentially just counts the number of items that we want to be primary and calculates how far from the top they should be, which is easy to do because we already know how tall the nav height is, the logo height is, and how tall each individual nav item is. So when we apply that, say, position 6 items, we get a top position for all 6. They know exactly where they need to be, and the mixin itself does all the work for us. And then last is a mixin to position the more button, because the more button now needs to know where all the nav items above it are and how many nav items are actually visible. So now, this is just kind of like a base, well, not really base, this is kind of the CSS to kind of kickstart everything. So we're going to take our first li that we know is our logo. We're going to set the height on it. We're going to call the mixin highlight, so we're telling it to be 95 pixels wide, to go absolute, to go to the right, and our exception here is that we're telling it how tall it needs to be. And then the other exception is that the image actually needs to fill the container, not be this tiny little icon. And the next line is, based on our minimum offset, we need to make sure we stylize the minimum amount of primary nav items that we want. In this case, it's 3. That's what gets passed to the mixin. So we tell the first 3 nav items after the logo to be stylized and move to the right. And now we kickstart the position magic, where we're saying, all right, as of the second one, start positioning all the nav items. And now for the fun part, where I had to pull back my middle school math and reverse engineer the EM value for the body. Essentially, I'm just trying to get back to the root EM. I don't even know if I want to walk through this, but it's in there, so I figured I should show it. But I'm essentially just figuring out the first fraction for how tall the nav is, accounting for all the items that we want to show, and putting that against the font size, and then giving me the EM back to what our body is instead of the actual nav. The nav thinks everything is based off of 11px, but my media query is going to be based off of the body, which is typically the browser default of 16 pixels. And then in that same media query, we are going to, at this point, decide when there's no longer enough room for the nav items to remove them from the primary section and let them go back into their native position off the screen. And essentially, I'm just saying, using an int child, saying show the first 4 if there's enough space, show the first 5 if there's enough space. And in order to do that, I'm actually counting backwards in my add media query instead of typically adding one. And another thing worth noting is that I actually had to position the more button based on a max height, and we're doing the opposite for the individual primary items, where we're doing it on a minimum height. So if there's at least enough room for 4, show 4. If there's enough room for 5, show 5. And here is a video that I think will play easily, showing the nav in action. And so yeah, that's my best use case actually for vertical media queries right now. And as you saw, it's not a responsive solution. It's not squishy. We were originally going to go with a squishy solution because it's the easy solution in this instance. We could just make the more button fixed to the bottom and then tell the client that, no, it's really cool, actually. You can scroll within this 95 pixel wide container, which would have worked, but the experience wouldn't have been great. So now, instead, we have a perfectly flexible component that can live on any VW property based on a really simple set of rules. And it's my best use case right there. So what else can we do? Just some ideas, because really what I wanted to do in this talk is kind of motivate other people to start thinking about the height. It's easy to overlook it. Let's stop. So other options are single-page navigations, galleries. When you have captions that sit on top of your image, based on your screen size, you might not have room for that text anymore. What are you going to do with it? You just hide it and say, oh, no, on mobile, no one wants to read the caption. No, we could probably do some really interesting things. Figure it out. Scrolling sites and takeovers, those kind of in-page interstitial ads or messages that are very subject to limited height because typically we design them to hold 100 words and the client puts in 1,000. So that's that. That's my argument for vertical media queries. And I don't know how long that was. I'm hoping it was like 20 minutes, 25. And that's that. Thank you.